Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Program for Financial Studies FinTech Innovation Salon, which is actually the first in its series that we launched this spring. And I do see people trickling in right now, so I know some of you may miss the intro, but I'm very, very excited and honored to host two powerful, trailblazing, innovative, and fun women tonight who will be in conversation with one another about really the process, the M&A process behind going from an entrepreneurial stage company into the arms of a large corporate, and the value creation process and the dynamics surrounded by the whole entire sale process. So again, this is the FinTech Innovation Salon, and my name is Melina Dennebeim. I am the director of the Program for Financial Studies, along with Harry Mamaski, who is the faculty director. And Kathryn Petralia is our featured innovator and founder this evening. She is a serial entrepreneur, which is really interesting because she has a perspective of probably failures and successes, although she'll probably just tell you about the successes tonight. And I'll read a quick bio on Kathryn and also on Lisa, because I don't want to miss any great information. But you can also click on the original invitation link, and we have their bios linked as well. So Kathryn has spent nearly 15 years with FinTech and e-commerce startups. She is really a tech startup guru. And before her entrepreneurial phase in life, she was the vice president of strategy for Revolution Money, which was later also acquired by Amex. And she was the director of corporate development for CompuCredit. In 2017, she was named to Forbes' list of world's most powerful women. So everyone here this evening, you are sitting with one of the world's most powerful women. And I would argue Lisa should probably be put on the list. Have you been on that list, Lisa?
No.
You're the deal maker for American Express. You will be on that list someday. And I think this is a great seminar, a great webinar for this week, honoring International Women's Day, which was yesterday. The leaders, in the social leaders, political leaders, economic leaders. And here we have really the economic trailblazers. And I'm very excited that thematically we could match up some important messages and highlighting the importance of leadership at the top and innovation by women. So going back to Kathryn, she's also on the boards of several large institutions, including Fannie Mae, the Woodruff Arts Center, CARE USA, and PadSplit and Tricolor. And so I also would like to introduce Lisa Marchese, who is a Columbia Business School graduate and also a fantastically dedicated board member on the Program for Financial Studies Advisory Board. So I've had the pleasure of knowing Lisa for several years now, and have moderated and served on a few panels with her. Lisa is great. She's a good storyteller. And most importantly, she is the executive VP, head of corporate development at American Express. So Lisa is in this global role, which oversees the responsibilities of the coordination of acquisitions, joint ventures, investments, partnerships, and divestitures for all of American Express globally. She's been in Amex for how many years?
A long time.
A long time, double digits rather. And she is really kind of an institution and manages 5 or 6 different divisions. Globally, the acquisitions team, integration, corporate development,
ventures,
and joint venture.
And the ventures group.
And the ventures group, which is more of the investing arm, taking a peek behind the screen to see if they like the company before they buy them, and offering great mentorship and growth opportunities. So Lisa has been pivotal in also creating protocol within American Express. Her contributions include the creation of M&A playbooks and governance protocols, capital and funding mechanisms, global strategic frameworks for identifying M&A targets, and JV governance models. So Lisa and Kathryn, I'm delighted to have both of you here this evening, and I'm sure our audience is dying to get started. A quick note on the format: Lisa and Kathryn will probably break up the next hour to hour and a half in 3 different segments. And after each segment, they'll take a look at the Q&A, which you can write into the Q&A It's the Q&A button. Some people like to write in the chat. I would just prefer the Q&A for this so we can make sure not to miss any questions. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. We're doing it 3 different times during the presentation so we can keep the flow. But I really look forward to a great and interesting hour and a half. And thank you both. And with that, I will sign off.
Excellent. Thank you, Melina, for that introduction. As always, a pleasure. And Kathryn, as I said before, it is nice to see you, even though it's not quite in person. You know, based on the introductions, I think you could see that Kathryn and I can't be more different. I have been at Amex for nearly 20 years in more or less the same role. I think Melina referred to me as an institution. I'm not sure how I feel about that. And Kathryn clearly, with 7 startups under her belt, has taken a different, and I would say more glorious route to success. But let's start at the beginning, right? As Melina said, 3 sort of topics and buckets to cover, you know, starting a company, funding that company, deciding when to exit is how we'll think through the conversation. But let's start at the beginning. So Kathryn, talk a little bit, if you would, about what makes an idea worthy of a startup, right? What gets you from that napkin or idea in your head to a business that you think will work?
You know, Rob, my co-founder, and I are asked this question all the time about starting Kabbage. And the question is often framed as, when you started Kabbage, do you think that it would become this? And my answer is always, of course not, because I don't work that way. I'm not a planner in that way. So when I look at an idea, I guess what I've learned over time is it should be solving an important problem. And I think, you know, I love using technology to solve those important problems. And I remember the very first technology company I was involved with was in 1995. And if you guys watch Silicon Valley, it was a lot like Pied Piper. It was a data compression company. And the idea behind the company was that you could actually use the internet to deliver software. Because in 1995, before most of you were born, you had to like use all these floppy disks just to upgrade your operating system on your crappy computer. And so the idea was we could deliver the software electronically if you could compress it to the right level. And I was like, wow, this internet thing is more than chat rooms. You can do cool stuff with it. And so I think that idea that you can do cool things with technology is always, and solve a problem, has always been part of what I think is interesting.
And then how do you take that sort of idea, you know, who do you go syndicate that with, right? Who do you go bounce the idea off of to make sure the technology and the solution can become a business and make money? And how do you think about who's the first person you hire, other than yourself and your other, you know, co-founders? Or how do you think about getting it started? I think that would be helpful for some of the folks who sit in that space today.
I do think a co-founder is really important to start. I think it helps you. We actually had 3 for Kabbage. And what was cool about that is you had lots of different views and people are good at different things. You know, what we say about the startup is, especially starting Kabbage, is we didn't really, you don't just wake up one day and you're like, okay, we're incorporated. Now we're a company and we're doing our thing and we're doing this Kabbage thing. But really what happened is you're doing it part of the day for a lot of days, and it takes some more of the day. And then you wake up one morning and you're like, wow, we do this all the time now. I guess this is our job and we have a company. So that's how it worked for us. And the reason it's so important, again, to have co-founders is because it takes some of the stress off. You can, you know, work with somebody else. You can, you know, share the load. There's often different skills involved, you know, that different people have, you can bring to the table. It was super valuable for us that Rob was a former attorney, because people are always like, oh, you save on legal bills, but it's not that at all. The critical thinking that you learn in law school is really important. And so being able to navigate that was really great. I happen to know a lot about financial services and FinTech. So that was my area. Our 3rd co-founder, Mark, was great at raising money, and we would never have raised any if it wasn't for him. So, you know, I think it's important to bring different things to the table. The first hire, it just depends on what kind of a company you are. If you're a technology company, you may want somebody with technology experience. We didn't have that person. Hiring that first person was a disaster. It was really hard. We argued about it because none of us had any idea if it was the right person or not. You know, I was like, that guy seems really weird and quirky. I like him. They're like, no, that's bad. We don't want to hire that guy. So it's hard. You just have to realize that the person you hire, it's like It's like buying a sofa. You'd like to buy a sofa that'll last for a while, but at some point you have to recognize that you're going to have to get a new sofa. And people are kind of the same way, because the same people that join a startup aren't always the same ones, you know, that are part of a 1,000-person company.
And I think it's interesting because, you know, as you say that, right, you and Rob founded Kabbage, and then you were there for years, right, building the business. And I think we also see a fair amount of times where the founder who had the idea, had the, you know, built the concept and the initial stages of the business, then steps into a different role as the business matures, because sometimes, as you said, that idea creation, that sort of vision of what is success doesn't always marry with that like operational nuts and bolts component of how do you scale. And I think it's also interesting, you know, sitting at Amex where everybody has a job description and roles and responsibilities are pretty well defined. When you go and you talk to certainly early stage companies, you know, you can ask what seems like some very basic questions. Who's your head of HR? Well, it's sort of part-time of Sally's job, and then John picks up the slack when Sally's not around. And so I do think the scaling piece and when do you hit that point of, okay, we've gone from the idea, now we need to bring in the folks that are subject matter experts in disciplines we don't want to go deep in, and scale the team, scale the operations. Like, how do you think about that piece of it?
It's funny, we had great success in some areas and we were abysmal in some other areas. And I think where we were really good was hiring in technology and product and user experience. That was always our core, and data. We were in anything, you know, sort of in that technology area, we were pretty good at finding the right people. As we grew, trying to find more senior people with bigger company experience to come into our organization, we were so bad at it. It was unbelievable how many great people we hired that didn't make it because it just wasn't a cultural fit. And I think the culture part, the way that worked was, it was a very flat organization. Kabbage, you know, I had 1 million direct reports, and so did Rob, and that worked fine for us. And everybody was kind of the same. Everybody's ideas were heard, and anybody could talk to anybody. And that was really important as part of the culture. And we brought in more senior people from more established companies. Invariably, they wanted to install some sort of hierarchy. And, you know, the organism just simply rejected it. It just didn't work. I mean, it was really, really bad. And so I think we were still learning, which is embarrassing 12 years into it, still learning how to bring, you know, the right people with the right experience to help us scale in a way that we needed to. It's definitely a struggle.
It's a little bit like, I feel, you know, I still need to be able to run an Excel spreadsheet, because if everybody on my team walked out the door tomorrow, I still need to be able to figure out the basic math. And there is a little bit of, you know, can you be both your IT support, you know, figure out how to order paper for the copier, and be the CTO and think big picture about where you want to take the technology? Because it requires a little bit of all of that, I would suspect.
And our answer was yes. Almost everybody that we had could do that. They were doers, and they were thinkers, and they were leaders. And it almost, you know, it's funny, people who came from big companies, often they were like super energized by the idea of coming to a smaller company. They would call us a startup. I would say, as a 10 or 11-year-old company, I'm like, we're not a startup anymore. We're just, you know, we're in puberty, or I don't know what you would call us, but we, they were excited about the idea, but then they got in and they were like, crap, I don't know how to do anything. I totally forgot how to do stuff. And so then they weren't respected by the rest of the organization because they didn't know how to do stuff. And so figuring out if people really know how to do things, or they just say they know how to do things or want to do it, that's the trick.
And that's really hard to figure out in an interview process, right? Because everybody can say the same things and talk the right game. And then it is a bit of when the rubber hits the road, is it really what you thought it would be? Which has got to be a challenge. Let's talk about, switching gears from team, let's talk about customer. Because I think the other thing that defines, at least from my perspective, the successful startup is a company that has real clarity on who is my customer and what's the customer need that I'm solving, right? And so as you think about the clarity that that required for Kabbage or for some of your other ventures, how did you think about customer? How early on did you have that sort of lightning focus on what are we solving for?
That's an interesting question because it did evolve over time. We started, Rob had the idea for Kabbage, and it was inspired by an API, which sounds super boring, but the eBay had launched this API in 2007 that allowed third parties to access seller and transaction level data. And what was interesting about that was that it was super detailed. So if you were an e-commerce business, then a third party, like maybe a lender, could get a really good visibility into your business performance. And so Rob was like, hey, it'd be pretty cool to offer a small business loan to an eBay business. What do you think? And I was Revolution Money at the time, long before the MX transaction. And I was like, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's go do that. And so we did. And so our focus was on eBay businesses out of the gate. And what we learned by interacting with the customers, we would go to these eBay on location events, which were like these big conferences for eBay sellers. And that was fascinating. But we spent a lot of time talking to eBay sellers, and we would show up and like go to the bar and buy them drinks. And you would have thought we were buying them a car because they're like, oh my God, you think we're a business? That's amazing. Like nobody thinks we're a business.
Somebody's paying attention to me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they were so excited by that attention. And we were like, holy crap, nobody knows these people even exist. And so that was our first interaction with the customer. And so I think that really stuck with us forever, just that feeling that these customers didn't feel valued. And we heard those stories. We expanded into brick and mortar several years later. So, I mean, as of, the beginning of the pandemic, 95% of our customers would have been brick and mortar, but we had the same exact experience talking to every customer. They were like, wow, this is amazing. I can't get this from my bank. 100% of our customers had a bank account, 80% of them with the top 10 banks, but they couldn't get what they needed from their service providers. And so keeping that customer in the center, I never really knew. We didn't know when we started Kabbage how important small businesses were to the economy. We didn't know how underserved they were. We learned it by talking to them over the years and developed this sort of like small business chip on our shoulders. Like we felt like not only were we underdogs as a startup, but our customers were underdogs too. And that really energized everyone at the company.
You made the comment about it's not where we started, so you had to pivot. I guess as you go through the journey, how do you know when it's a pivot versus when you're cutting bait and trying to figure out a different answer, right? Because I also think there is a propensity to say, oh, but I've started it, or this is my thing and I want to make it work, when sometimes the right answer is scrap it, start with something else. So how do you think about when is it pivot versus figure out a different answer?
It's funny that you bring that up because we've always had this view that we called it the P word. We thought pivot was a bad word because we thought it meant like the thing you're doing wasn't working, so you had to do another thing. Whereas we always viewed we're just drawing these concentric circles around our business. Like as of the beginning of the pandemic, we're still serving eBay customers. We're also serving a whole bunch of other customers, all in the same automated way we thought we always were. So it's great. It's a great point. We never had to look for product market fit because we were selling money. And everybody needs money. So I think the difference is like of course you could sell it to them in a crappy way that they don't want, I guess, but we were selling it in a good way. So that was easier. But I think it's harder when you don't have that product market fit out of the gate. Money's easy, other things are harder. And so this navigation of product market fit is not something we really had to do at Kabbage. And it is something that most entrepreneurs have to do because you have this great idea and it turns out it's just an idea that you thought was awesome and your co-founder thought was awesome. And maybe somebody gave you some money and they thought it was awesome too, but you're the only 3 people that like it. So that is really hard. And you just have to not invest too much in your first version, make sure that you can get out there and test it and see if it works. And if you spend all your money on the first thing, then it's really hard to raise more for the next. I think that's where hey, scrap it and start over. You have to have enough money to do that.
And that's where, and so folks should feel free to ask questions because we're going to continue to move on to sort of a different set of topics. But before we do, two things I would say, right? one, for those who sit in my position, it's why I say all the time to my team, like, give the direct feedback to the companies that come and talk to you about what works and what doesn't. Because being nice and polite and trying not to hurt people's feelings is never going to help them get to where they need to get to. And so everyone, while it might be an uncomfortable meeting, everyone is far better served to say, well, this doesn't work for large banks for these 5 reasons, or you haven't thought through some basic of third-party lifecycle management or control and compliance that you need to know if you're a bank. Words I know you love, Kathryn.
I know them now, though. I didn't know what that was before, but now I do.
But to me, I think that, you know, that sort of clarity of feedback is hugely important and often undervalued or sort of softened because people want to be polite. And I think that that's something I would just counsel folks on being incredibly transparent about. I guess, as you think about folks, Kathryn, who are sitting in my shoes, who want to be in your shoes or want to go think about what it would be like to be in a startup, how do you translate, you know, someone who's been in corporate America for 5-10 years of their career and want to go do a startup? Like, what is it that they should come sell you on that they can do, or what should they be prepared to do?
Gosh, there's so many answers to that question. And it's a good question, and it incorporates something that's in Q&A right now. So that's perfect. I think it's important. I'm going to go backwards a little bit. I talk to students all the time who are graduating. They're either maybe getting their MBA or they're in undergraduate school, and they say, what should I do next? Should I go join a hot startup, or should I go like to the consulting firm and go that route? And Christelle, who works for us, who's amazing, former McKinsey person, she's so bright. She always said, Kabbage is a great place to work if you know how to work. It's not a great place to work if you never learned how to work. And you can learn how to work at a larger organization. I think there's a lot of value in doing that early on. I never did that, so I'm not a good example of that, but I also can't navigate, you know, Excel the way Christelle can either. So and I was an English major. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think it's important to understand how to work. I think if you are in corporate America for 30 years and you're like, oh, I think that startup thing would be really fun, you probably don't realize, you know, what it's going to be like. And people are going to be shooting Nerf darts at you and stuff and drinking beer and dogs everywhere. And that might seem a little crazy. But if you're looking to change and it's a reasonable time for you to do that, I think recognize that the work style is different. Like, people work more hours. They, you know, are always on. It's just high energy all the time, everyone doing everything. And the other thing is it's incredibly collaborative. So people are working across the entire organization, and it's a very small company. I mean, ours was 300 people at the time of the transaction. Everybody knows everybody. And so being comfortable with that environment where anybody has a voice and everybody's voice is heard is important. And there isn't a lot of hierarchy can be kind of strange for someone who's been in corporate America for 10 years. So recognizing that ways of working are different, I think, is important. And recognizing it's a risk. There's a financial risk. There's a risk that it's not going to go well. And you, no matter how much you negotiate your deal, you can't negotiate that company could suck and go out of business. So I think it's important to be comfortable with taking that risk. And if you're willing to take that risk, then ask for lots of equity, because that's the best way, to be able to go on to your next startup, if that's what you want to do after that company happens, after you've run your route there.
And I think sometimes, so the risk piece, I couldn't agree with more, right? Which is, you need to be cognizant of the risk, and you need to know what plan B, C, D, E, F, and G are, right? But I also think there is some value. You know, it's easy to talk about the entrepreneur who's had multiple successes under their belt, and therefore funding's easy, and we'll come to funding. But I also think that there is value in some of the founders that I've talked to who are like, well, my first company failed, but now I'm on my second one and I'm doing things very differently because the first one failed. And to me, there is that you want to see the repetition, and you want to see the learning and the development. It's not always about perfection. And I feel like sometimes people who come from the corporate environment where it's about, well, here are my goals and I achieved all my goals and I did all of this in a nice linear fashion, struggle with a little bit of, sometimes it's the, hey, that didn't work, I'm going to pivot, to use the P word, and move on to something else. And that's a little bit more acceptable in the, or necessary even, right, in the startup environment.
It is true. Failure is important. The comfort with failure is important. It's something we were never good at doing, was getting people to embrace failure in the organization. And I learned something, over the years, that it wasn't because people were afraid that they were going to get fired. We never fired anybody for making a mistake. They just didn't want to look dumb. And so, companies, startups tend to attract, smart people who, are young and energetic and enthusiastic, and they care a lot about how they're perceived. So we worked really hard to create an environment where people could say they messed up so that we could explain how we learned from that. That's really hard to do.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to funding. How do you get money? So now, fast forward in your journey, right? You've got a great product, you've got an MVP in the market, and now you need money. I think the big questions that people talk about are, when is the right time? How far along do you need to be? And how do you think about it? You made the comment about getting equity and making sure you get equity, but bringing somebody in creates some dilution. And not all funding partners are created equal. Let's just say it that way. So let's start with the first, right? What are the conversations that you have about, is now the right time to go out and do fundraising? And what does that mean for the organization and those of you, and how you spend your time?
Well, every business is different. Every business's capital requirements are different. Kabbage was, when you're in the money business, you always need inventory. So we were raising in two different ways. We had equity that we were raising, and we also were building a brand, which we didn't really think about when we started, that how much we'd ultimately spend and invest in marketing to acquire customers and to build a brand, and why that was important. And it turned out that was a wise investment for us, but it just depends on your type of business, whether that's a good idea or not. But we also needed debt capital to fund the loans that we were making. And that was our first product, was a lending product. So we were always raising money. I mean, I remember after our Series A, we've been out on the West Coast like forever raising money, mostly getting turned down, but trying really hard. And it was like a month after we closed our Series A, and we're all in San Francisco again, or we're in wherever, Palo Alto, I think is where we were. And we're going into another meeting with a venture firm. And Mark and I are like, what the hell are we doing here? Didn't we just raise money? Rob's like, no, we're just gonna have another meeting. And it turned out, we were basically raising money again. So I think it does depend on your business. What I will say is, a lot of people worry about dilution. A lot of people say, oh, I don't want to take a single dollar because I don't want to give up any control. I don't want to give up my company. I want to have all the stuff. And my response to that is always the same, which is, I'd rather have a small piece of something big than a big piece of nothing. However, I don't want to, suggest that it's not amazing if you have such a great idea and you're able to bootstrap it and you can grow it and generate revenue. That's amazing. MailChimp is a great example of a company that's done that. And there are many, many, many more. I think Calendly may also be, they're an Atlanta-based business, has raised very, very little money. So I'm in awe of those guys. I think it's great, but most people need money. And so you have to be willing to give something up for it. And, we've always said the same thing as well, which is just take the money. Like there's a company that I was talking to, and they said, well, we're not sure if we should raise 2 million or 2.5. And I was like, if somebody wants to give you 2.5, take the money. Yeah. So exactly. Well, but I'm talking to someone who's in the business of giving people money. So you're like, yeah, take my money.
But take my money.
So
is it easier to raise 2 million than 200,000? Right? At some point that becomes true too, right?
It's so much effort.
Right.
It's like packing. When you pack to go away for 2 weeks or 2 days, it doesn't matter. You've got the same amount of crap in your suitcase pretty much. So you might as well just take more money. Go on a better trip.
Yes. So let's talk about, you covered dilution. Let's talk about how to, as you get to be more choosy, right? Getting the first investor in is sometimes the biggest challenge, but as you look for subsequent rounds, how do you think about who's the right partner? And again, from the Amex perspective, we run a corporate venture firm. And so when we look at companies, we think about not necessarily like, what are we going to do with them tomorrow, but is this interesting technology that's going to shape the way that payments, services, customer experiences are delivered over a 5 to 10 year time horizon? And do we want to put some money in early and then figure out how to pilot, test, partner over time with a company? So while we don't bring a lot of dollars all the time, we do bring the, hey, we're working with Amex, or we can give companies access to customers or data, or think about joint product development. So how do you think about just plain money and lots of it versus somebody that would be more of a corporate venture sponsor who would be bringing other things to the table?
And we talked a lot about, do we want just plain investor money or strategic dollars? That was a big conversation. We wound up taking a lot of strategic dollars in our series D and E, really, from financial institutions with whom we were partnering globally. So that was good for us because it sort of cemented the relationship, and it meant that they kind of had to care a little bit as we were working with them. And that was useful. And it gave us some testing grounds and some folks who were dedicated to us. I think that was really helpful. What we always talk about when we mention, sorry, I'm in the office. When we mention raising money is that you're going to be related, you're going to be with those investors for a long time, potentially. So Jonathan Ebinger from Blue Run Ventures, who led our Series A, was on the board from, am I right about that? 2010, December of 2010, until the transaction with American Express. He was a fantastic board member, became a very good friend of ours. And it was really important that he, that we had that relationship, that we knew that we could always talk to him and go to him when we needed something. It was never adversarial. And so understanding that you kind of need to be friends with these people is important. Jonathan actually went on to bring us another amazing board member, someone everyone here may know, or many of you may know, a certain Laurie Hodrick, who I believe is in the audience. He brought her on as an independent board member several years ago, and she was amazing, and was a former professor at Columbia. And I understand it required many, many points to get into her classes because she was so popular. And there's more. Melina, I think, said that she founded this program that is running right now. Is that correct? So thank you, Laurie. It's good to see you. I wish that we could all see your red face right now.
No, I would actually like to take this moment and highlight that, number one, Laurie Hodrick was my favorite professor at Columbia Business School. Aww. And she was the reason why I came back to actually work for the university. And I also had to I made myself sit in her front row of advanced corporate finance 3 days a week. It was twice a week or 3 days a week. 9 a.m. was an ungodly hour for MBA students, but I showed up, and I think sitting in the front row, she remembered me and then wanted to hire me back to the university years later. So Laurie Hodrick is again, I would put her in one of the most accomplished women I've ever met category. So, and she is the founder of the program for financial studies. But that's my shout out to her.
Thank you. So if it wasn't for Jonathan being such a great friend to us, we would never have met Laurie, and we're very grateful to that. So to him for that. So again, investors can be investors for life potentially. So it's important to get to know them and trust them and care about them.
And there were a couple of questions that came in, I think, a little bit at the tail end of the first part where we were talking about starting the company, about the culture piece and being able to facilitate, that culture of it's okay to fail, or it's okay to have a different point of view. As you think about the cultural norms, did the company change when you got investor money in? Was like, how did you make sure that your partners from a financial standpoint were going to support what you wanted to achieve from a cultural ambition? I think folks have some questions about how that continued through the Kabbage journey or some of your other companies.
Our investors knew exactly who we were and how we operated. We weren't like different people in the investor meetings, and then we got all silly later at Kabbage. We were ourselves all the time. And that was really important, because what I've learned from not only investors, but from now dabbling in that myself, is that it's really important to invest in your founders. And you really have to trust them and believe that not only do they know what they're doing, but they can lead and inspire a team. And so, a good investor would never invest in a company and then say, okay, time to change the culture. Everything you're doing is wrong. I'm not going to support what you're up to. we might have had an investor like that during the course of our years, and it was no bueno. So let me just tell you, don't do that if you think there's not a cultural fit. But generally, no, everybody was very supportive of that, of the culture that we had. And no one came in and said, oh, you need to do something differently, because they're investing, because I think what we're doing is working. And a lot of it is the people behind the company that make that work.
Can you fire an investor if they're no bueno?
Oh, Lord, if only. You can, you have to buy them out. So the stars have to align appropriately. And Laurie right now is laughing to herself about that, because she watched that from the front row.
Excellent. As we talk about funding a little bit and then culture, today, a lot of funding is tied to diversity metrics and how to think about how are you contributing to some, the diversity discussion. So was that and obviously, as Melina pointed out, we represent at least some part of a diverse crew, but did that shape your thinking early on in terms of your team or who you hired, or did people ask questions differently of you, do you think, or was it just part of the DNA of what you built?
There's a story I like to tell about raising money, which is we had many, many meetings in Silicon Valley, or the peninsula, or whatever I'm allowed to call it. And so we're going up and down Sand Hill Road, meeting with all the fancy people. And we probably had like 25 or 30 meetings. And I sat down at the table as per usual, and a woman sat down at the table. And I was like, holy Moses, this is a woman sitting at the table. It was the first time a woman was in a meeting that wasn't bringing me water. And I was just amazed and dumbfounded by it. And I hadn't really noticed the absence of women prior to that, but I certainly observed the presence of one. So I would say that from a, fundraising perspective, it was clear that, there was selection bias going on. But I had two male partners. And so it was, I limited that a little bit. Rob is the biggest feminist I know. So he was always really supportive of and wanted to bring on lots and lots of women. So I would say that was never even a thought. It was just part of who we were. I would say where we struggled probably was on other types of diversity, whether you're talking about African or Black Americans, or whether you were talking about Hispanic or Latinx. I'm not good with all the words, so sorry about that. I'm just trying to say all of them. But I think that's where we stumbled a lot. And while we did have a really diverse crew across the whole organization, we didn't have that in leadership. And that was an area where we made some commitments last summer that we were going to make some changes. And so I think we were really open to, our employees' feedback. They came to us and said, you guys aren't doing that right. And we're like, yeah, you're totally right. We're going to fix that.
Did you find it harder to get employee feedback the bigger and bigger you came? Because again, I go back to, if you think about the model that's a startup, you're all sitting in one room, right? The room between gnomes, which is what is that, right?
Between two gnomes, yes.
Between two gnomes. And then you have a couple hundred people in your organization. Like, it's harder to make that real-time feedback happen. So what were some of the things that you did to make sure, as you grew and as you scaled and as you had layers, perhaps, you continued to get that kind of feedback from the employees?
We had a lot of feedback mechanisms. First of all, Rob and I have never had offices. We've always sat at desks. Like, if I flip my monitor around here, you can see like this sad, empty space with lots of desks all around me. So hold on, that's a little distracting, sorry. So I think the fact that we're always out in the world was important. And I think anybody felt that they could come and talk to us at any time. We had a weekly town hall where anybody could ask questions. We had an anonymous feedback email. I'll tell you, the people who ran people operations at Kabbage would tell you that no one was afraid of providing feedback ever. We got lots of it all the time. So I think because our culture started that way, it stayed that way. And it didn't matter whether you were, working in collections, or if you were running product, or whatever your job was, it didn't make a difference to us who you were. Everybody's feedback was important.
So we've gotten a couple questions that get us to sort of the next segment, which is the decision to exit. That's where I enter, stage left, right? But before you get to me, how did you guys decide that it was time for an exit, or what goes into that decision that is a management discussion versus a discussion with your board? And how do you think about that?
You know, it's interesting. You know, when you're a venture-backed company, you always know that at some point something's going to happen. You're either going to go public, or somebody's going to acquire you, or you're going to just generate so much revenue that you're going to pay back all your investors and everybody's going to make tons of money. That is one you don't see very often, but it's still fun to imagine that could happen. So that's always in your mind. And usually when you're, I don't hear this question as much, but the question was asked early on when we were raising money about what are your exit opportunities? Who would be interested in buying you? I mean, that is sort of in your mind almost from the very beginning. So, so we thought about it before, and it's funny because American Express was always a company where we thought, oh, that would be an interesting tie-up for us. You know, we all serve small businesses. We've spent a lot of time with the teams talking about different ways we could work together. It was always sort of in the back of our minds. And so I think you decide to sell in the same way that you might decide to go public, just because you've reached a certain point where that makes sense. I think, I could be wrong about this, Lisa, you can talk about this better than I can. It always seems like acquisitions are kind of opportunistic. I mean, maybe a company's about to go public, and so therefore, you know, another company has been looking at them as a target for a long time. They're like, no, don't do that. I want you to. It just feels like that's how it works. You tell me.
So I liken it a little bit to corporate dating, right? Because if you recall, we didn't meet during the pandemic, right? To your point about the foresight of who do I think is a good exit from a strategic standpoint, set aside IPO. You know, we had partnership conversations. There had been some other biz dev type of conversations that had happened over the years. And so to me, I always liken that to corporate dating, which then makes, sometimes people look at the transactions and they're like, oh, well, that happened out of the blue. And if you don't know that there was that like dance or that get to know you part, or the not even a real preconceived notion of, oh, we think this is going to turn into an acquisition, as much as it's like, this is an interesting company in our space, we should try and figure out how to partner with them. And fast forward 12 months, do we really like what we see, or is this okay? And I think that's the process that, particularly from an M&A standpoint, we tend to go through. And so opportunistic, yes, because you can never sort of pick the timing. But I think it's really hard to just rock up to a company and be like, hey, we've never met and we want to buy you and here's a price. Because they're like, wait, what? Who are you? Right? Like you would have had that reaction if hi, we haven't met before, but I'd like to buy your company. That's not the way that works either. And so I do think from a buying standpoint too, there's a right time and a wrong time. And I think that's the sort of back to my feedback piece, you know, with smaller companies. I think from a corp dev standpoint, a lot of times it's the feedback that's like, hey, you guys are really interesting, but your price expectations don't meet ours, or now's not the right time because we've got 12 other things we're trying to solve for. And maybe there is a right time that's going to be later, but let's not torture ourselves today if it's not the right time. So I think that's a bit of how we think about it as well. How important was, as you thought about Amex's owners, right? How important were some of the things that we've talked about, right? Was it all money? Was it about the culture? Was it about the vision of what we could do together? I think that is you know, some of the questions that folks had. And then we can compare notes on what we thought what we thought before and after, maybe.
You know, I'm going to tell you a story that's a little embarrassing. When I went to college, I was 17 and I showed up in the dorm room with my things, and the day went on, and the end of the first day, there was a meeting with the RAs or whatever they were called. And they were answering questions and giving people feedback and stuff, and going over the rules, and they finished talking. And I was like, hey, so what time do we have to be back, you know, at night? And everyone looked, they were like, what? Like, what did you just ask? What is wrong with you? I was so kind of sheltered from all that. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what a sorority was. I mean, I was like going through the whole thing through plexiglass. I just really didn't have a lot of information. And so subsequently, when employees have asked me, I'm going to flash forward many years, when employees have asked me, about the transaction, or if they have, questions or frustrations, I'm always like, dude, I've never sold a company to American Express before. This is the first time I've done this, so there wasn't like a rubric for this. I'm sure there are some things maybe I could have known. And so I think the culture was important, but we had a lot of ideas about the culture before we joined, because we'd spent time. We knew that it required many, many meetings to get a deal done. So we knew some things about culture. But we felt like our values were kind of aligned in serving small businesses. Everybody we ever talked to was really lovely. People cared about the company and about the brand, and those things were really important too. And I think they're kind of emblematic of the culture itself. Are there things I might have wanted to do differently? If I could go back in time and do it again, there probably are. But for the most part, for us, it was almost like the same thing with starting a company. You want to work with people that you respect on work that you think is important, where you think you can have an impact. And we felt that all those boxes were checked.
Yeah, and I think there's a question in here about synergies or how to think about value creation. And I think from our perspective too, price and price discipline is always important, right? Because that's the way people talk about deals. But at the end of the day, right, we think about EPS dilution, we think about synergy creation. We actually think about, does 1 + 1 = 3? Because when we talk about successful deals, no one ever talks about, oh, we paid too much or we paid too little. The question is always, what have you done to serve the small business customer? Did you introduce new products and services because of that transaction? Or did you bring in talent that is, either in the organization from a business standpoint or moved into the technology organization or whatever that is? And so have you created that value by being able to do more than either one of us could have done on our own, but the two of us together could create new and unique offerings for a customer segment? And I think that to me is like more than the dollars and the cents, how we think about it. In that, as you said, right, the people are a huge piece of that. I would say, if you talk to folks in my seat and why transactions fail, it's because they don't get the retention piece right, or they think that they're buying a platform and a capability, and what they don't realize is they need the people who know how to run it, or know how to make it work, or know how to innovate products on top of it. And so I do think, from a corporate standpoint, that cultural match is as important, because for us, we want to make sure you guys show up and are happy. There's a little bit of how much do we tell you before we get married versus after, because, we don't want to scare anybody away either. But it's interesting that I think that cultural piece is so similar or consistent regardless of the side you sit on. One of the other questions is balancing innovation with the machine. Let's call us the machine, right? So obviously, and we're sort of early innings in this, but I guess, how do you think about that balance, right? The freedom and flexibility to do whatever you want as an independent private company versus being inside Amex, where there's compliance, rules, goals, metrics, and getting the best out of both worlds. Any tips or thoughts for folks?
I think there's this idea of scale that's really important. So at Kabbage, we, we're the largest non-bank small business lender, and we had 250,000 customers, and American Express has millions and millions and millions of small business customers. And we were like really excited about how big we were and how much we had scaled, but we would have needed to grow many, many, many times to get to where American Express was. And that's just in the US. I mean, I'm not even thinking about global, and American Express has a global footprint. The name is ironic, but that's okay. So I feel like it's really important to remember that no matter how you compare to your peers, and our peers were, other FinTech serving small businesses, there are these huge organizations that can really help get you to many more customers. And you can also help them get to more customers too, because I mean, ideally the technology and the automation that we brought to the table could help American Express expand to other businesses that may have been, hard to serve in ways without, complete automation. And so I think that's where 1 + 1 = 3 is, being able to get past these like compliance and regulatory and legal hurdles, which is possible to do. It just takes a little longer than we're used to. And once you do that though, I mean, the sky's the limit.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also, finding, I like to say that that's sometimes the corp dev role, right? Like we do the deal, but it means we spend an inordinate amount of time with you and your team leading up to the acquisition and to the close. And then sometimes it feels like the close happens and all of a sudden it's a bunch of business people that you've never met before. And I think part of our job is to also help translate, like, what is the corporate expectation and how do you figure out how to navigate that efficiently as possible, right? Because for those of us who have been at any large corporation for any number of years, you do figure out that efficiency piece. And so I think it's, it's incumbent upon us to help you guys as the new kids to figure that out too. So I'm flipping through the questions to see what else we have in here. So it's interesting. I think people ask the question about a little bit, and I'll take this one, a little bit of like, what happens if the deal doesn't happen? And I think, I'm sure you've had experiences where you thought you were going to have a deal and you don't have one, and we've had plenty of those too. I think from a corporate standpoint, right, the key is to be very clear about what it is you want and are looking for in a partner or a joint venture, an acquisition. Owning something 100% is far easier than owning something jointly with someone else, right? So I think, if I were to describe our bias, it would be for full acquisition or small investment, right? The bookends work for us. But to me, the question is, have you spent enough time in the market, and do you have a good enough view as to the capabilities that are out there that you can articulate, this would be first prize, this would be second prize, this would be third prize, so that there's no, I somehow got locked out of the market because I had my eye on one thing and one thing only, and if it didn't pan out, I missed the boat, right? Do you think about that the same way as you think about opportunities, partners, things that didn't happen? Like, is there that, I have a plan B, C, D, E, F, and G, right? Like we talked about before?
You may not have it formalized in your mind, but what I learned from Rob years ago is you have to be willing to walk away. You can't be so, because when you're shopping for a house or something, you're walking around, you're like, oh, I can totally imagine reading a book in that nook with my dog, and I'm just going to love that. And then before you know it, you like live in the house mentally. You can't mentally live in the house. You have to imagine a world without that house. I think that's really, really important, because otherwise it leads you to make decisions that are potentially unnatural and don't create a benefit. And in order to be willing to walk away, you have to have a plan B and C and D.
Mm-hmm. All right, any other questions coming through? I think we've answered a lot of them. Kathryn, what would you say as people are thinking? If you were to sum up the journey and think about where you are today versus, where you were 7 years ago, what's the one piece of advice that you would give your younger self to be like, here's something you should really know, or, hindsight's 2020, I wish I had known? Because I feel like we always end up with a list of things that, oh, if I had known that, I might have done that slightly differently. Is there anything that you would share with this group?
I only get to go back 7 years.
I don't go back 20. I mean, I
want to go back much.
I don't want to go into pure therapy here.
Well, I have two different things I would say. One of them is, from way earlier in my career, started a couple of, internet e-commerce type companies. One was a FinTech, one was e-commerce. And I just had no idea that there was a thing called a venture capitalist. So I'm just so annoyed that my younger self didn't know anything about that and didn't try to figure that out a little more effectively than I did. So that's something I would have said a long time ago. And, and also I think women in particular are super, super fortunate to have the benefit of networking that wasn't available to me when I was younger. Even if it's LinkedIn, I'm so proud of and, inspired by the number of women who come to me. They don't know me. They just find me on LinkedIn. They're like, hey, would you give me 30 minutes? I'd like to talk to you. And I try to do it as much as I possibly can because I didn't have that when I was younger. And if I could have figured out how to do it, I would have. If I went back to like starting Kabbage, there are two key lessons. I think one of them is, and I learned this from Rob too, the truth is always in the middle. It's so easy to have like this quick reaction to information that you get, but it's so important to take time and to get all the sides because invariably, the story isn't the story that you heard. The story is an amalgamation of information that's been distilled through lots of different filters. And so I think that I would have loved to have known that 12 years ago rather than learning it, the hard way 5 years ago. And I think the other one is about hiring. It's just when you start a company, you spend a lot of time hiring, like a lot of time. So figuring out not only who the right people are, but when it's not working out, acting quickly on that is really, really important. And I wish I would have known more about that earlier on.
Excellent. Melina, any final questions for me or Kathryn that you think the audience would benefit from hearing?
I think you both have been very open, very, very welcoming in terms of the questions and sharing details about the journey. I guess I have a question for Kathryn. What did you think, what did you want to be when you, well, how do you even phrase this in the past tense? When you were a child, what did you want to be when you grew up? How does the path, how does this come out of, a lot of people ask me, because I was an English major as well, and Lisa, you were an English major, right?
Psychology, but sort of the same.
Same thing.
Humanities. So how did
you get a job with a psychology degree?
How do we end up as tech entrepreneurs, Kathryn, as investment bankers in my past life, Lisa in M&A? What the question is, where did you start? Where did you think you wanted to go? And then this is going way back, but then how did you end up in the entrepreneurial area? Was it divergent from what you thought you might be in the early years?
I hate this question. I mean, it's a fine question, but I can't answer it very well because I didn't have a thing I wanted to be when I grew up. I don't remember ever being a kid and thinking, I really want to be a astronaut or something. That was never in my mind. And it's consistent with me. Like I'm very opportunistic. I meet people, I do things that I think are interesting. And my entire career has been defined by being opportunistic. And so I got a computer when I was 9 in 1979. And it was like this Radio Shack computer with 4K of memory. Like it couldn't even, like my phone is like a bajillion times better than that computer was, but it made me comfortable with technology. So I think what's important is the things we're exposed to as children really inform what we are interested in or comfortable with as adults. And so I think I was always comfortable with technology because I had a computer. I was always comfortable with language because I read a lot of books as a kid because I was a nerd. And I think that led to my being comfortable with communication and technology, which helped me meet people and do new things. And I was always comfortable taking risks because my parents never set boundaries. I'm not in a bad way, but they weren't like, you can't do these things and you have to do these things. They let me make mistakes. And so I was comfortable taking risks. And I think we're so much more defined by our experiences in childhood than we realize that we probably are.
I think that was a fantastic answer to a question you don't like. That's really good guidance. And the reason I asked that is because a lot of people attending today are still very early on in their careers trying to figure out what they want to do. We have MBA students who are in their mid-20s on average. I think the average age right now is 26. And it's interesting looking back, you can connect the dots and see how everything pieced together to get you where you are today. But when you're in it, it's hard to navigate. It's not linear. And it's certainly, people don't do enough, I call it soul searching into what their true strengths were when they were kids and how that can translate into something that they're passionate about as an adult. So I like asking that question. Thank you for answering.
Yeah, sure.
I would add to that, because I agree with Kathryn, which is not knowing what you want to do for a living is a bit of a blessing, right? Like that's where I started, and I was a media planner for a bit, and I did research for a long time, and I was then a consultant because that's what you do and you can't figure out what else you want to do. And I never set out, like you can always look backwards and tell some nice progression of how you got to where you got to that sounds compelling. But to be honest, like, you know, I came to Amex and I thought it was going to be for a brief period of time. And at some point somebody was like, hey, you should go interview for the Corp Dev group because they need somebody who thinks like you do. Whoop, my lights just went out. And I think that is, clearly the lights turn out at Amex at 7 o'clock because there aren't enough employees in the building. But I think that willingness to try some new things and the willingness to say, I'm going to try something for a period of time. It wasn't until I was in the Corp Dev group for about 4 years that I was like, oh, I actually really like this and I'm really good at it. And maybe this is what I'm supposed to be. And the story has yet to be written. So I think that flexibility and not rushing to this is what I want to be when I grow up is hugely important to navigate a career.
Thank you both. It was really a pleasure getting to be a fly on the wall this evening. And I'm sure, you know, we had over 150 people attend. Thank you to everyone who spent their evening hour with us at 6 o'clock. If you have any questions, if the audience has any questions, they can feel free to reach out to me. My information is on the Program for Financial Studies website, and I can always direct to Kathryn or Lisa if you have questions for them. And it was really a pleasure hosting both of you. Thank you so very much. And with that, I wish everyone a good evening. And our next, actually, I will announce that our next featured innovator, entrepreneur in our FinTech Innovation Salon will actually be the co-founder of Open Invest, which is an ESG and custom indexing investment platform. So different topic. And we'll also shed light more on kind of our predictions for the asset management industry, future and innovations, but that will be coming up. So with the invitation you received for tonight, so you have the information for the Open Invest, which I think takes place in late April, April 28th. But keep in touch, stay tuned. And again, I wish everyone a good evening and thank you, Kathryn and Lisa. Take care.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.